Hi, I'm Matt Muratori, the state representative for the 1st Plymouth District. Plymouth Colony began in 1620, and this year we celebrate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the colonists on the Mayflower. Governor William Bradford led the colonial government for over 30 years, and he was primarily responsible for the creation and preservation of what we now know to be the Plymouth Colony records. You will hear about these records from our presenters, who will share with you our country's first deed, the Treaty of Mutual Protection between the colonists and the Wampanoag, the first law passed, giving us our right to trial by jury, Miles Standish will, and other remarkable records. This year we celebrate 400 years of history, and you will see the ancient New Plymouth Colony records upon which the foundation of our democracy was built. I hope you enjoy this virtual tour of the Plymouth Colony records.
I'm John Buckley. I'm the Registrar of Deeds for Plymouth County. We're here in the Plymouth County Registry of Deeds reading room. When you enter this building, you see a sign above the main door that says America's First Registry of Deeds. And the reason for that is that in the colony period, based upon the arrival of the Mayflower, Governor William Bradford started recording real estate documents. What you're going to see right here is the first deed in the handwriting of William Bradford that basically laid out the property rights of 7 families along a street they named Leyden Street, first called the street, later known as Leyden Street, based upon Leyden, Holland, where the colonists had lived for many years. Thankfully, the state legislature in 1818 allowed funding to preserve these records. They allowed the interleafing of these records to protect them, put them in bound books, and we have them in a side room here in a temperature and humidity controlled vault so that these records will be preserved for the next hundreds of years. It's a great opportunity for people to see what is in our records, from deeds to wills to court decisions, and they'll all be promoted by prominent individuals as we go through this program. And so although we would have loved to have seen you here in Plymouth at the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower, we're coming to you through this virtual program. We hope you enjoy it.
We are going to be known for, and our legacy is going to be the written and the spoken word. We have taken the written and spoken word, and it is going to serve, I think, future generations, as President Clark mentioned so well. It is going to be very important for those future generations to learn about us. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And I think we have a golden opportunity in Plymouth and to continue to carry forth our banner that says Plymouth, America's hometown. So I am appreciative of everyone that has worked so hard on Plymouth 400. Said, this isn't going to happen. We are going to continue to make a difference, and you have. And that is outstanding. We have got some tough days ahead of us. There's a lot of work. Michelle and I talk about it. There's a lot of work that's going to have to be done in the next few months with some sensitive decisions to be made. But I'm no longer worried about what we're going to leave behind, because I think it's just going to grow and be a continuation of what you as Plymouth 400 did. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Hello, my name is Dr. Paul Jehle. I'm president of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, as well as a pastor of a local church in Plymouth, Massachusetts, the New Testament Church. I want to talk to you about religious tolerance in relation to the Pilgrims. And because of their pastor, John Robinson, who had helped them form that covenant in Scrooby, they said now they were molested, hunted on every side because of their faith. Some friends had died in the Tower of London for their faith. Therefore, they went to Holland, where they wrote and said there was religious freedom to practice your faith. But of course, that was in the context of its history. We all must remember that history has to be interpreted in its primary context. We can't just interpret it from today. because when we do that, we take it out of its normal soil in which it was first understood. And when they went to Holland, there was a bit religious freedom for them, but the civil government still enforced religious beliefs. And therefore, when John Robinson began to teach them, he was more tolerant than most preachers. He was more independent thinking. He would tell them this: go directly to the Bible. Don't just tell what someone else says. You find out what it says. And that meant that seeds would be formed for liberty of conscience that would be unusual in its time period. Just as a few examples, we recognize that Robinson himself had said that once they separated from the Church of England, you should never even have communion or fellowship with anyone that still attended the Church of England. Later on, he said, you know what, that was wrong. We have to have more freedom to do that. That's unusual in his day. We would look at it today and say, well, you know what, more things could have been done. And they were eventually by seed. We say that sometimes in history things happen in seed form and they eventually grow. And that again would happen with Roger Williams. And then even further than that, we might say among the Quakers. We know that laws, after Brewster died, Bradford died, in the late 1650s and early 1660s, the Puritan influence and even the second generation of the Pilgrims here in Plymouth began to pass laws against Quakers and their free expression, to actually punish people if they don't go to church, and all of these kinds of things. Well, you know, the only son of John Robinson, their pastor, who came here, Isaac, came here to Plymouth and then ended up helping to found the town of Barnstable and Falmouth, and he stood up against the persecution of the Quakers, saying they had the same religious freedom everyone else had. And imagine that, the only connection to the Pilgrim Church, John Robinson, would stand up for that. So we see hints, we see seeds that will come forth eventually in religious liberty. But folks, it would take 200 years for that to get true fruition, where in the Constitution, whether it's the federal one for the First Amendment or the state one, Article 1 of Part the First in the Constitution of Massachusetts, that would start to actually have true religious liberty and not just toleration. It took more than 200 years, and that's the lesson of history. It takes time for these things to grow, for we're usually blind to our own faults in the time at which we live. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20. And that's exactly the year we commemorate for the Pilgrim's arrival.
On Saturday, the 11th of November, 1620, 41 of the male passengers aboard the Mayflower signed a document we know today as the Mayflower Compact. The aspiring colonists had just arrived at Cape Cod Harbor, today's Provincetown, following the decision not to proceed to their original destination near the mouth of the Hudson River. They had left England with a charter from the Virginia Company of London that authorized them to establish a plantation, a colony, within the jurisdiction of Jamestown. But that jurisdiction only extended as far as the 41st parallel north latitude. Cape Cod is just outside that margin, so their charter was no longer valid. There had been new mutinous speeches among some of the disaffected men who wanted to separate themselves from the others, as they were no longer bound by the charter, even though they were still under contract to their financial backers. Knowing this would threaten the entire enterprise, the colonial leadership crafted an agreement that would, quote, mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation until a new charter could be secured. The striking thing about this pragmatic, if temporary, solution was that the leaders did not pull rank or resort to force to bring the dissenters into line, but rather invoked what were highly unconventional principles of democracy in an era when strict social hierarchy to guarantee all parties political equality. Now, this agreement had no legal authority outside the little community itself, and while its memory was cherished by Plymouthians, it was not accorded the same importance as the successive charters that during the life of the colony. The original document, in fact, was not preserved, but the text of the document was recorded in both the Plymouth Colonial records and Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. However, what was lacking in the letter of the law was more than made up of in the hearts of later generations. Cited by numerous authors and orators, including John Quincy Adams, as the cornerstone of American liberty, the Compact joined the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, and even the Magna Carta, as a foundation document in the triumph of democracy.
My name is Linda Coombs. I am a citizen of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe from Martha's Vineyard. My background, my entire career has been working in museums, and so I have become a historian as a result over the years. Trade was something that had been going on with Native people for thousands of years, and Wampanoag people had connections like out to the Great Lakes, and Native people generally had networks all over the continent. So it wasn't a new thing. And trade with Europeans had actually begun 100 years before the Pilgrims settled, because there were ships coming back and forth. They would come to trade or explore or fish, and then they would, leave and go home when they had finished their business. And it was the English Pilgrims who were the first to settle and start to build homes. But what a lot of people don't stop to think about is that the Pilgrims sailed into the territory of the Wampanoag Nation. Okay, it wasn't just random empty land. There had in fact been a huge plague, and the Wampanoag people lost 75 to 90% of our population, but there were still 20 or 25,000 Wampanoag people left. So there were lots of people around that the English people were interacting with. And at that point, trade, kind of ramped up, because the English were wanting furs, beaver furs and other types of furs that they were sending back to England for the production of beaver felt hats, to pay debts off that they owed. And they were putting a lot of pressure on native hunters to give them these furs or trade for these furs with them. And the result of that was that it upset our hunting economy, okay, and threw it way out of balance. It resulted in the extinction of the beaver in this area and the depletion of many other species as well. So it affected not only us as people, it affected the land and it affected all the animals. So in spite of the fact that you hear that this particular thing, trading, helped the Pilgrims to survive, it, however, was extremely detrimental to the Wampanoag people. And that's a part of history that doesn't get expressed as much, but it needs to be recognized for what it is, and because it wasn't all just about the Pilgrims. We were here then and we're still here now.
Hi, I'm Mary DeAmbra, president of South Shore Realtors. This Plymouth County record shows the division of land amongst the colonists of the Mayflower, the Anne, and the Fortune. And this is the reason that South Shore Realtors exists today, as well as the real estate industry itself. The investors who funded the original colonists' trip to the New World did not allow the colonists to the benefit of home ownership or land ownership. Instead, the colonists lived within a communal system. Having little incentive to work property they didn't own caused dissension to grow, and a period of time called the starvation times began. Many of the passengers who came on the Mayflower died. In 1623, Governor Bradford and his assistants transitioned the colony to private property ownership. This resulted in improved conditions, which helped the colonists from starving. This record is what initiated the right to freely own property in the United States and contributed to the American dream of homeownership. From this division of land follow millions of land records over the last 400 years.
My name is Frank Gaziano, Associate Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, they brought with them from England the right of trial by jury. On December 17, 1623, the Colonial Court ordered that, quote, all criminal facts and also all matters of trespasses and debts between a man and a man should be tried by the verdict of 12 honest men, to be impaneled by authority in the form of a jury upon their oaths. During the debate over the language of the order, the authors struck the phrase 12 men and replaced it with 12 honest men. We still seek the verdict of 12 honest jurors, not just men, of course. All jurors are sworn to fairly and impartially decide cases without fear or favor, based upon the facts in the law presented in the courtroom.
Hi, I'm Kathy LaNatra. I'm the state representative of the 12th Plymouth District, and that includes the towns of Kingston, Plimpton, Halifax, parts of Plymouth, parts of Duxbury, and part of Millborough. And I'm also a realtor, so I feel right at home here in Closing Room 1. So I'm here today in Closing Room 1, and we're going to talk about the first deed. If you look to my left, we have an example of the land sales that generated the birth of the communities, like Mattapoisett, Sandwich, and Middleborough, and other towns surrounding Plymouth County. Transactions between colonists, colonists in the Wampanoag, and transactions between the Wampanoag themselves are recorded here. Consideration ranged from English currency to wampum, from English wheat to English rye, dry and well conditioned, Indian corn, goats, and cows. A 17th century transaction of property located in Leiden, Holland, and another where the property was transferred as a dowry.
My name is Pearl Sears, and I'm the town clerk for the Town of Plymouth. We're here today to talk about the law that initially started a town clerk, and it was declared that each township would have a town clerk that would record the births, deaths, and marriages. The first town clerk for the Town of Plymouth was Elder Fonts, and we have his book here today because of this law. And it has births, deaths, and marriages that go back to about 1640 that would otherwise not have been recorded.
I'm Therese Murray, the former senator from the Plymouth and Barnstable district and the former president of the Massachusetts Senate. And I'm going to talk about life in the colony. The laws of the early 17th century colonists were strict and unforgiving. In 1639, a law was passed that whoever shall profanely swear or curse by the name of God shall be set in the stocks not to exceed 3 hours. In the same year, a law was passed making it illegal to solemn compaction or conversing with the devil by way of witchcraft, conjure a con, or the like. And to ensure that the laws were carried out throughout the colony, it is enacted that in every township there shall be a pair of stocks and a whipping post erected. And here we are, 400 years later, sitting in the Superior Court of the new Plymouth Courthouse, and our laws have greatly changed.
I'm Donna Curtin, Executive Director of the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum here in historic downtown Plymouth. I'm going to tell you a tale of sexual misconduct, starting with Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous novel, The Scarlet Letter, which made New England infamous for its history of punishing and publicly humiliating sexual transgressions in the early colony. But what Hawthorne wrote about wasn't just fiction. If we look to Plymouth in 1658, the colonial court passed a law making adultery a crime that shall, quote, be severely punished by whipping 2 several times. Those who were found guilty had to wear 2 capital letters, A and D for adulterer, cut out of cloth and sewn on the uppermost garments of their arms for all to see. Colony records include many examples of people accused of sexual activity outside the bonds of marriage, which was against the law and very harshly punished. On September 2nd, 1639, Mary Mendham was convicted for, quote, using dalliance diverse times with Tinson, an Indian, and after committing the act of uncleanness with him, she was sentenced to be whipped at a cart's tail while processing through the streets of the town for all to see, and to wear a badge upon her left sleeve. And if she shall be found without it abroad, then to be burned in the face with a hot iron. This would have marked Mary Mendham for life with her offense everywhere she went for the rest of her days. Now Tinson, her partner in this crime, was sentenced to be well whipped with a halter about his neck at the post, because it arose through the allurement and enticement of the said Mary that he was drawn thereunto. Just a year later, in November of 1640, Francis West and his wife Marjorie were censured both to be set in the stocks for, quote, incontinency before marriage. That is, they had intimate relationships before they were actually wed. Poor Francis was likely a carpenter, and he was subjected to the additional humility of having to actually build the stocks that were set up in Duxbury, where he actually served out his sentence and punishment. Harsh punishments and public humiliations are evidence that sexual misconduct, as defined by the laws of the time, was indeed a serious affair in early Plymouth.
Good day, my name's Lee Hartman. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the Town of Plymouth, Massachusetts, and I'm here to talk about land use and zoning in Plymouth and Plymouth County. And my comment at the beginning would be, the more things change, the more they stay the same. One of the earliest zoning laws we've had in our country occurred in Yarmouth in 1639, where in that town there was a requirement that any property owner was a man at that time, that he could not own more than one lot with a house on it. And if he had two lots, he was not allowed to keep those two lots and just have one home on it. And as I said earlier, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We see that kind of discussion today. And in modern days, we call that sprawl. And we're dealing with that very same issue today in Plymouth County, in Massachusetts, across the nation. It's, again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So as we move forward, we see that land use, which is protecting the public health, safety, and welfare of its residents, is something that is a trend that we see all through town records. And if we look at March 1745, we see a vote of town meeting where every male head of a family be obliged to procure 10 rat heads or 10 grown blackbird heads and bring them to the town treasurer for proof, or face a fine if they failed to do that. So again, looking back as far as 1745, that public health and protecting the public health was a very important thing. And obviously we do it differently now, but back in that time, they were required to do such crazy things as kill rats and bring their heads to town hall to make sure that we have limited issues with pests and petulance in the community.
Welcome to the Alden House historic site in Duxbury. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. We are standing in the Alden House, the family's homestead of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Mullins Alden since 1627. This current house was built by their descendants and lived in until the 1920s. But the land on which we stand today has been in the family since the 1627 land grant. It has the distinction of being the only Pilgrim property to be continuously owned by the same Pilgrim family. Today it is owned and operated by the Alden Kindred of America, which runs it as a museum and welcomes visitors from around the world to explore this Pilgrim story. The wonderful Plymouth Colony records help tell us a little bit about the Alden family, since there are so few records that exist from that era. We know John and Priscilla were married by the land division of 1623. They had 2 children by the cattle division of 1627, and then the move to Duxbury beginning in 1627 and 28, when the land around Plymouth Bay was divided up. And thus begins the next chapter of the Pilgrim story, as the Aldens, the Standishes, the Brewsters, the Soules, the Sampsons, and the Browns, and many others began the move to Duxbury. They raised their families, they built farms and homes. Governor Bradford notes in his diary that they all wanted cattle and a great amount of land around it to keep them, and thus the families were divided all over the bay. He also notes a little bit later, and perhaps a little sadly, that they soon sued to become a town because it was so very difficult for them to travel back and forth to Plymouth to attend worship and church. It was the beginning, though, of the next chapter of the Pilgrim story and the expansion of Plymouth Colony into New England and eventually a new nation.
I am Richard Pickering, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Historian at Plymouth Patuxent Museums, the living museum of Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag homeland. Right now, we are in the 17th century English village, and you are going to hear every now and then the sheep, the goats, and the cows all around us. We're standing in Samuel Fuller's garden. He was a deacon of the congregation and was also a barber, surgeon, physician for the colonists. He came over on Mayflower, one of the 102 passengers. Of those 102, roughly 18 were covenanted servants, and Samuel Fuller brought a boy by the name of William Button, 14 years old, and he died within view of Cape Cod. Servitude was a common part of English life. There were three basic relations within the English family: husband-wife, parent-child, master-servant. And what you find is that everybody at one time or another served someone else. It was a way of climbing in the world and making good connections. Your length of service all depended upon the type of work that you were doing. Back in England, typically for agricultural servants, it was from harvest time to harvest time. But in New England, service tended to be longer because a master also had to pay for the travel of a servant. So it could be anywhere from 4 years to 11 years. We don't have as complete a picture of their lives as we do for other people. We know from the records that some of these households didn't function very well. And in fact, right here you see a record related to James Cudworth, who at this time was living in Barnstable. He also lived in Scituate. And the record tells us that his servant, Thomas Bird, had run away from him and had broken into 2 houses in Barnstable, and he was whipped for the offense. Things did not always go well. We know that Elizabeth Warren, the widow of Richard Warren, had to go to the courts to have a servant chastised for blasphemy, that he had sworn and taken the name of God in vain in her presence. Sometimes servants and masters needed to go their separate ways, and this was often done at the agreement of both. And here in this record, we see John Winthrop selling the time of a servant by the name of Joseph Gross, and Joseph agreed to going into a new household. There were times that it did not work, and it was more advantageous to part company. There were also times that the servant was no longer needed, and so for a covenant to be sold away meant that he or she had constant work. The relationship between a master and servant was more than a simple exchange of labor. During the time that a servant lived in another man's household, he was responsible for his lodging, his food, and his clothing, and his medical care as well. The contracts that were written between a master and a servant also specified what was to be paid at the time the service was over. Often it was a little bit of money, maybe a new suit of clothes or a gown for a female servant. And we find that the relationships between masters and servants often were establishment of friendships, because the objective of a servant was to get into a household of connection, where later in life they could get the help of the master. So I think you find that although the families of the 17th century don't resemble our own, in that the majority of us don't have servants around the household every day, we can see that there were relationships that built community as we try to build community today, and find that the Registry of Deeds is a way of understanding where we came from, recovering the lives of servants who may not appear in genealogies because they didn't remain in Plymouth, they didn't necessarily leave descendants, but were an important part of the community.
Greetings, I'm Jim Peters Mashpee, Wampanoag. People of the first light. When I say people of the first light, I think about we're the first contact people, and we have, over the years, have had a lot of ships come to our shores and meet our people for one circumstance or another. Some were eventful, happy times meeting different people, informative. Others were confrontational. And we've even lost people, got kidnapped and taken away. Many left, a few returned. You know, over the years, we got a chance to understand the European people a little bit, you know, as much as we could, and formulated our ideas. And I thought I believe we were pretty confident in our relationships with them and how to deal with them and so forth. You know, but I think the game changer was in 1615 or so when we had a pandemic. A white man's disease wiped out up to 90% of our people. It devastated our whole way of life. You know, think of our culture, how we're oral history people, and we pass down, you know, our history, our teachings, our people, you know, all of those stories from one generation to the other, and they remember those and pass them on, and that goes on from generation to generation for eons. And with that pandemic, our chain was broken. I think it devastated the way that we really looked at the world, and we also were fortunate enough to have some of the people that were kidnapped to come back for one reason or another, and was able to share with us what Europe was like, you know, what the people were like. When the Mayflower came in around 1620, we knew they were there. It was very different from the other people who came because they came with women and children, and understanding that they were here to stay. And so the Massasoit had an opportunity to talk to Squanto and Epino, who found their way back here, and they talked about what it was like and what to expect. And I think our Massasoit Usmequin was well prepared to, with an understanding of, you know, who these people were and what to expect, and whether or not that we were prepared to actually deal with them. So I think he realized the change had come, and that he needed to do something in order to develop a relationship. I think to save his people, actually, knowing that the European people's outlook on life was so much different. You know, when we start to, and from hindsight, we realize that they believed it was a God-given right to come here, to look at the resources. The natural resources were so abundant. They were unscathed at that time, and they realized that was coming.
My name's Chad Hunter. I'm actually the Plymouth Harbor Master, and we're here at the Plymouth Maritime Facility in beautiful Plymouth Harbor. And we're here to talk about some of the firsts. We're here to talk about one of the first ferries. In 1636, Joseph Rogers had a government order which allowed him to run a ferry across the Jones River in Kingston. And in doing that, he was able to charge each person a penny at the time. So if we take ourselves back to 1636, and you know, now there's bridges and all sorts of infrastructure to cross the Jones River. So now this infrastructure exists, but back in 1636, there was no infrastructure in place. So, you know, to get around the Jones River, you'd have to travel almost all the way up to Plimpton, or you could risk crossing the river, getting soaking wet and maybe freezing on your walk home. So in this case, Joseph had a really great idea to have this ferry to shuttle people back and forth and allow people to sort of travel north and south along the coast. So I think this is a really great first. I think it's somebody that had a great idea. Ferries are used widely, even today's day of age, and you know, there's a few reasons why people will still use a ferry versus building a bridge or a tunnel. Number one, it's usually cheaper to run a ferry than to build and maintain this infrastructure. For some, it's definitely a more enjoyable experience. In some cases, there's no other route. If you look at the Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard ferries, really, you know, other than by plane, which in 1636 didn't exist, the only way to get there was by boat, by a ferry. And they still use that quite heavily in today's day and age.
My name's Tim Cruz, and I've been the district attorney here in Plymouth County for the better part of the last 20 years. So it's been an extraordinary privilege to serve as a district attorney in the area where I was born and raised and where I have grown up. And I'll be quite honest with you, it's really a special honor to be here today as pertains to marking the 400th anniversary of the voyage of the Mayflower, the founding of Plymouth Colony, as well as historic interactions between the Wampanoag and the English citizens. And although, it's almost 400 years ago, some things in our society never change. There's always going to be people who abide by the law and individuals who don't abide by the law. And investigations back in the day, 400 years ago, there was one thing about them. They were very short and justice was very swift. And I'm here today to discuss the earliest murder trials in America that are held here in Plymouth. The first person executed for murder was an original Mayflower passenger by the name of John Billington. And in 1630, John Billington shot and killed John Newcomen. That pair had quarreled off and they were enemies for the most part. And Billington killed him as he shot him. And Billington was subsequently tried by a jury and was sentenced to death by hanging. And he was hung. A more notable case that happened here in Plymouth Colony back in the 1600s, back in 1638. And the factual scenario is as follows. There was a gentleman by the name of Arthur Peach, who along with two co-defendants, Thomas Jackson and Richard Steinings, were tried for the murder of a Nipmuc man by the name of Pennawanicus. A fourth man, Daniel Cross, had been captured and was charged, but he subsequently escaped trial. Now the facts are as follows. Men that were out trailblazing one of the Narragansett trails near Providence found Pennawanicus badly injured and barely able to walk. The injured man had suffered significant injuries to his abdomen and to his legs and was losing blood rapidly. But notwithstanding his deteriorating condition, Pennawanicus was able to give the men an account of what had happened. And he had stated that he had been traveling from Plymouth to deliver bolts of valuable cloth and wampum to the chief of the Narragansett tribe of the North American Indians. Along the way, he briefly encountered 4 Englishmen in the woods, and these 4 individuals were subsequently identified as Peach, Jackson, Steinings, and also Cross. After he left them, he encountered them again. And after he encountered them again, they encouraged him to sit down and to smoke a pipe and relax and have a conversation. When he did that, one of the men took their sword and stabbed Pennawanicus through the leg and into the abdomen. He leapt back. He was able to avoid further contact with these individuals and ran into the wood, leaving his wampum and his valuables right there. And he was gone. The men did not chase him. They assumed he was dead. However, he wasn't dead. And rescuers who found Pennawanicus were able to get the word ahead to Roger Williams, who I stated was the individual who started out down in Providence, Rhode Island at the time. And the Nipmuc man was able to give Roger Williams brief details of what had happened to him from this event. Now, Roger Williams had met these men and was able to identify these 4 attackers because he had received word just shortly before, a few days before, that there were some Englishmen who were out in the woods who didn't have any food, didn't have any resources, and they were in a position where he thought they may starve. So he sent out a group to go get them, bring them back, which they did, gave them food, help, and at that time had a conversation with them regarding if they were going to go back to Plymouth, if he could carry some letters for them. So once he got Pennawanicus' story, he realizes that he had unwittingly helped the escapers attack. In the meantime, people were talking about the violent attack. And the Indians from the Narragansett tribe approached Mr. Williams to state that they were concerned that this attack represented the beginning of a wave of deadly attacks against natives. Williams tried to assure them that wasn't so. And the 4 Englishmen were subsequently apprehended and delivered to the English settlement in the town of Portsmouth. Now, there was all sorts of conversations at that time as pertains to who had the jurisdiction, where this event occurred, who was going to prosecute these individuals. And as these conversations went back and forth between these different groups, there was outrage that the English weren't taking immediate action against these 4 men, and that was growing amongst the Narragansett tribes. With rumors of their anger growing, the people of Portsmouth began to fear that they may be attacked by the Narragansett tribe, as long as those 4 men were kept there. Finally, Governor Prince of the Plymouth Colony stated that if those men appealed, their cases would go to the Crown, would go back to London, and it would look like they were trying to protect them. Accordingly, he claimed jurisdiction, and they tried those men in Plymouth before they were able to take those steps. They were tried, and they were convicted. Daniel Cross escaped to Maine before trial, and Maine ignored Plymouth's extradition request. There was subsequently a triple hanging of these 3 men, and they felt that it set a strong deterrent that Plymouth Colony would treat the murder of Native Americans equally.
Good morning. My name is James M. Sullivan, and I've been the first justice here at the Plymouth District Court for the last 5 years. It's my function to make sure that the court administers the daily tasks that we do on a daily basis in an orderly fashion. The records that we're seeing here today come from the Treasury accounts, and the records of the Treasury reveal one of the primary means that the colonialists used to enforce their laws, which were assessments of amercements, or as we call them today, fines. The documents of the Treasury illustrate the various and sundry offenses prescribed by the colony and the fines that were assessed by the colonial courts. For example, Samuel Matthews was fined for sailing from Yarmouth to Boston on Ye Lord's Day. Joseph Ramstead was fined 10 shillings for being drunk a second time. John Holmes did not get off as lightly as Squire Ramstead. He was censured for drunkenness and fined 20 shillings. He was also ordered to sit in the dock or the stock for all the town to see. Nathan Sowell was fined for being detected for telling several lies. After having been found guilty of slander by a jury, Edward Dowry was fined 50 shillings, 30 of which went to the man that he slandered, and the remaining 20 shillings went to his sovereign lord, the king. Common members of the colony were not the only ones subject to these strict rules. The colony took its politics very seriously as well. One of the colony's edicts provided that if any man were elected to governor of the colony and he did not execute his office for the year term, he would be amerced or fined 20 pounds sterling, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. However, should a governor be elected and serve his term, he could decline re-election without penalty. The system of leveling assessments and fines ran deep into the colonials' personal lives. Woe betide the colonists that consorted with a Quaker or attended a meeting of the Friends. Fines were meted out against those who failed to attend public worship, as well as those who refused to take the oath of fidelity of the colony.
All right, good morning. My name is Edward Boyle, and I have the privilege and pleasure of serving as the first Justice of the Plymouth County Probate and Family Court. I'm here today to talk about some of the records that are available in the court, or have been available in the court. One of the earliest records we have is a will of Miles Standish. Miles Standish was born in 1584 in Lancashire, England. He became an English military officer and was sent over to Holland, where he participated in many battles and was commissioned a lieutenant. At the conclusion, he returned to England and was promoted to the rank of captain. He held that rank when he arrived here in the new colony with the Pilgrims. Standish's role in the New World evolved in the 1640s. He took on various administrative roles. He served as a surveyor of highways, treasurer of the colony from 1644 to 1649. He also served on several committees charged with setting boundaries of towns and viewing and protecting waterways. On October 3rd, 1656, Miles Standish passed away and was buried in what is now known as Miles Standish Cemetery in Duxbury, Massachusetts. On May 4th, 1657, Standish's sons, Alexander and Josias, and his widow Barbara were appointed to administer his estate according to his will. The inventory filed in connection with his will gives the reader a wonderful insight into the lives of the colonists. The inventory included, amongst other things, one dwelling house and outhouses, oxen, mares, colts, heifers, sheep, rams, 14 swine, great and small, muskets, carbines, guns, a sword, one old feather bed, one still, 2 beer casks, and many books, including Bibles, the history of the world, and the history of Turkey. Miles Standish served an honorable role in the new colony, and he will be remembered as such. He was a military officer, as I indicated, and was actually the protector of the colonists when they came over on the Mayflower.
Hi everyone, I'm Susan Moran. I'm the state senator for the Plymouth Barnstable District, and I'm proud to be here today as part of the project that John Buckley from the Plymouth Registry of Deeds is doing on the history of the district. In Sandwich today, we're at the Town Hall, which is an incredibly historic building, and Sandwich itself is the most historic town on Cape Cod. This is about the 10 men of Saugus. As it says right here, the 10 men were authorized to have liberty to view a place to sit down and have sufficient lands for 80 families. And here we are today.
Hello, my name is Michael Maresco, and I am the town administrator for the town of Marshfield. And I am standing on the shores of the Cut River. And many firsts in America were recorded at Plymouth County Colonial records. one of the very first Colonial public works project was the dredging of the Cut River, which is right behind me and off to my left. In 1636, it was ordered by Plymouth Colonial Court that the Cut Green to Harbor be made accessible for boat passage. It shall be made 18 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Now today it's a little wider, and it's about at mean average tide about 15 feet deep. The old mouth of the Green Harbor River was closed by a violent storm in 1805, and a new canal was dug behind Green Harbor Beach. The waterway is known as the Cut River, and we're on its shores. The present entrance to Green Harbor was opened by a storm in 1810, 5 years later. It was further opened by local fishermen under the cover of night to get the entrance larger for their fishing boats.
Hello, I'm Brenton Simons, President and CEO of American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, where I have worked for a number of years and where we serve more than 340,000 members and millions of online users at AmericanAncestors.org, and where we have 1.6 billion records for the public to use. One of our major databases right now is with the General Society of Mayflower Descendants and Family Search, giving access to the lineage papers for Mayflower descendants. But I'm very proud of the fact that I'm descended from William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, the second governor. I'm descended from William Bradford 3 times over. And he has a really interesting life story. He was born in Austerfield in England in 1590, and he became interested in the separatist and Puritan movements as a very young man at the age of 12. And later, when he left the Netherlands and came to Plymouth, he was appointed the second governor of the colony, and he served in that role intermittently for 33 years. One of the things that, of course, he's especially well known for is writing the history of Plymouth, the Book of Plymouth Plantation, which records the early history of the colony. And the other thing I'm really proud of as an historian, not only did he leave that legacy, but he also was important and instrumental in the recording of early documents. And so wills and deeds and other records. And so in Plymouth, he's noted as the person who recorded the first deed in America. And so that's a great legacy as well. And every year I've been asked for now a number of years to speak at the Illuminate Thanksgiving commemorations in Plymouth and to wear pilgrim attire and recite his one small candle words, which go, "One small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone unto many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation." And those words really embody the philosophy of William Bradford. And finally, I just have to say we owe him a great debt of gratitude as a preservationist. He recorded records that survive to this day, and as an historian, in many ways, the nation's first historian. So we're very proud of that.
My name is Ben Brewster. I've been using the streets of Plymouth for the last 95 years. And as a matter of fact, where I am now sitting is the site of my many greats-grandfather, the William Elder Brewster. The streets of Plymouth, many of them have pilgrim names. There's 2 or 3 Brewster Streets, Avenue Roads. There's Carver Street, there's Bradford Street. There's a lot of connection to the old folks here in Plymouth. The naming of streets after the Pilgrim Fathers does not stop just in Plymouth. The Registry has a deed written in 16-something or other, Situate, by Hatherley, so that the continuation of pilgrim names continues. There is the town of Brewster down at the Cape. There is the town of Carver, who's named after the first governor. The Brewster name in spite of this, on streets, is not in many other places in Plymouth, but the old Pilgrim names. But the names are all over. All of the Pilgrim descendants have descendants here. Mine just happen to have the same name. But many of the other people in town, even though they may mean something else, are Pilgrim descendants. After 12 generations, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, there are literally probably millions of Mayflower descendants, many of them still here in Plymouth.
Hi folks, I'm Steve Cole, Executive Director of the Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation here in Plymouth, Mass. I'm here to tell you today about deed transactions and borrowing. In 1639, a man by the name of John Combe borrowed money from John Barnes. He needed to make arrangements to pay that back, and so he approached Mr. Thomas Prince. This was the second occasion that Prince had borrowed or lent money to Mr. Combs, and so each time he required some kind of a mortgage to secure the debt. In this instance, the debt was secured by a brown cow named Berry, an early example of a used cow loan perhaps. It wasn't uncommon, in fact, to have debts paid back using something other than cash or currency. In fact, a transaction that's recorded at the Plymouth Registry of Deeds shows that in 1647, land transaction was paid back in part using corn and cattle. For information about this and other transactions, please visit the Plymouth Registry of Deeds. Thank you, folks.
Hello, my name is Plymouth County Sheriff Joe McDonald, and I am very, very pleased to join you today on what is a very interesting journey through the records of the original Plymouth colony. The records of the Plymouth colony are near and dear to all of our hearts. Not the least of which reason is we live here, but secondly, we proclaim ourselves, and I believe rightfully so, as America's hometown. It's a motto, and it sounds nice, but take a moment, as I oftentimes do, and think about the meaning of America's hometown. Right here in Plymouth is where America was born. You know, I'm here to talk today about military matters, the wonderful things that are contained in our archives that are available to be viewed. As the sheriff of Plymouth County, I like to consider myself the professional descendant of Miles Standish. Many of the laws that were passed in the early days, many of which can be seen here in the archives of Plymouth County, talk about some of the things. The 1636, the draft that was authorized by the governor and his assistants to provide for laws of domestic tranquility, criminal laws, if you will. Veterans benefits. It's interesting to note Miles Standish was hired as an advisor, but was later elected as the commander of the Colonial militia, which was the military of the time. And he continued, even after he had aged really out of his ability to perform that role in the field, he was elected until his death and continually elected as the commander of the local militia, which is really quite an impressive thing. We are the first laws with reference to veterans benefits. As people can imagine, the technology to injure and kill people was very advanced, and medicine was not quite so advanced. So oftentimes, people that suffered injuries that might be easily treated today were considered grievous and life-changing back in those days. So we knew as a society that we wanted to honor but to support those people. And those veterans benefits provided that if maimed, the individual shall be maintained competently by the colony during his life. Miles Standish, again, I cannot overstate the importance of his role in the administration of the colony. He was one of the principal advisors to where the colony would be located for purposes of not least of which was fresh water and food, but also defensibility. He is the one who oversaw and really laid out the defense of the blockhouse and the palisade that can be viewed today at the over at the museum. And it's really quite impressive, everything that Miles Standish. Now, as I stand here today as the sheriff, my job is certainly thank God, much more limited than that role that Miles Standish played. But I do, when I travel, like to say that we are, there may be law enforcement agencies in the country that are older than we are at 1692. But here again, our professional ancestor in Plymouth County law enforcement is Miles Standish, and he goes back to 1620.
I'm Bill Keating, Congressman from the 9th Congressional District of Massachusetts, which includes much of what once was Plymouth Colony. 400 years is a long time, not necessarily in the greater context of the world history. After all, we're a relatively young nation, but in terms of what we've endured since 1620. 4 centuries of wars, peace, division, more wars, reunifications, epidemics, pandemics, and commemorations. We're in the midst of both a pandemic and a commemoration in 2020, and we still endure. But what remains after 400 years? Well, the people and the place. Leyden Street, for instance, is still here, originally called the Street. This main thoroughfare from the harbor to Burial Hill has remained a residential street in downtown Plymouth since the Pilgrims first established it. And what of the people? 102 Mayflower passengers tragically turned into 51 by the end of that brutal first winter, but they endured. We're privileged to have access to this priceless time capsule of countless historic land transactions, legal firsts, and, in some cases, civic precedents brought over from England and still in use here today. These colonial records tell a story of 400 years of endurance and perseverance. Now, the Mayflower didn't arrive to a deserted continent. In point of fact, 400 years is just a snapshot of the time in what is really thousands of years of human history in an area that was once called Patuxet by the indigenous people who made it their home. And like the people and places who have endured for 400 years, so too have the Wampanoag people who are still here, from Herring Pond, Wampanoag in Plymouth to their neighbors in Mashpee and Aquina. The Pilgrim legacy endures. The Wampanoag culture endures, and despite our latest trials and tribulations in the face of a pandemic, we will endure through great virtual programs like this one, to live events starting in the spring, and God willing, keeping Plymouth's legacy alive for 400 more years. As I stand here just steps away from the United States Capitol, I am amazed when I realize the experiment started by a small band of pilgrims 400 years ago, and that has blossomed into 50 states and the greatest democracy in history. Congratulations to Plymouth 400 and Plymouth County Registry of Deeds for sharing our history and for celebrating the beginnings of America. Thank you for joining us in this tour of the Plymouth Colony and its records.